Sometimes a good deed can take you too far. You think you're saving someone, but you don't know who they are, or who's watching. Out here, nothing happens without consequence. A look can mean a promise. A moment of kindness, a debt you didn't know you were making. There are stories of men who stepped into the fire without knowing it was lit, who crossed invisible lines drawn by blood, an oath, and tribe. Some returned changed. Others, not at all. This is one of those stories. A trail with no map. A face remembered in the dark. And a choice no one saw coming. On the far edge of the frontier, where the grasslands stretched until they dissolved into sky, John Carter lived a life that barely rippled the dust. A former cavalryman, he now measured his days by the slow rhythm of ranch work, the creak of a saddle in the morning, the smell of leather and sun-warmed wood, the soft shuffle of cattle in the evening light. His home was steady, if unremarkable. He had married young, to a local girl named Margaret. She was plain in face and manner, with no quick wit or restless dreams, but she kept a clean house and a calm table. Life with her held no grand passions, yet no storms. It moved like the turning of a slow wheel, predictable, familiar, and safe. That late afternoon, the sky glowed with the low sun, spilling gold across the ridges. John was riding home from a long job when the land narrowed into a canyon. The air cooled there, shadow pooling under the red rock walls. That's when he heard it. A sharp, urgent cry, carried above the rush of water from a stream below. He spurred his horse forward, rounding a bend, and saw them. A man in a ragged coat had cornered a young woman against the stream's edge. Her dress was rich with beadwork, the kind that caught stray rays of light and held them. A single feather curved through her dark hair. Though her chest rose fast with breath, her posture was unbent, her gaze steady, defiance flickering even beneath fear. Something in that unshaken pride struck him. Not as attraction, not yet, but as something worth remembering. The man's hand twitched toward his belt. John's revolver was in his grip before thought could catch up. One crack split the air, echoing against stone, and the threat crumpled. John swung down from the saddle, boots striking the gravel. He stepped toward her slowly, offering his hand. She hesitated, then placed her palm in his, and he pulled her gently up from the bank. The water hissed over stone behind them, the canyon holding its breath. From his canteen, he poured her a measure, watching as she drank, eyes half-lowered. He searched for words, but none came, and she seemed in no hurry to fill the silence. Then, just as his pulse began to slow, she drew in a deep breath and let out a sharp, clear whistle. It carried far, slicing through the canyon air. Before he could ask, she turned from him and ran, swift as a deer through the rocks. From the narrowing path ahead came the sound of hooves. A white horse burst into view, its mane catching the last light like a river of silver. She caught its reins mid-stride, swung into the saddle without breaking motion, and in moments both rider and horse had vanished beyond the bend. John stood alone in the settling dust, the stream's rush once again the only sound. For a moment, he thought of following, but the sun was already slipping lower, and there was no trail worth chasing. He mounted up, the echo of that whistle lingering in his mind, and turned his horse toward the long ride home. A week passed, each day much like the one before. The sun climbed over the plains, painting the fence posts in long, lean shadows while John worked with his tools. The air was dry, the kind that carried sound far, yet the only noise was the slow creak of wood and the muted calls of cattle. It was in the middle of hammering a loose rail that he felt it, a weight on the back of his neck, the distinct sense of being watched. He paused, lifting his gaze toward the rolling grass beyond the corral. She was there. Standing still among the stalks, half hidden by their sway, the woman from the canyon watched him. Her dark hair stirred with the breeze, her eyes fixed, unreadable. There was no sign of the white horse now, only the curve of her shoulders and the steady way she held herself. He knew her instantly, though he had not expected to see her again. For the briefest moment, something warm stirred inside him, curiosity, perhaps, or the faint spark of that pride he'd glimpsed before. Then the thought of Margaret crossed his mind, cool and grounding, and he forced the feeling aside. Neither of them moved. The air between them seemed to stretch, thin and taut. Then, like a shadow slipping under a door, she was gone. One moment her figure stood against the grass, the next it had vanished into the sway of the plains. Far from there, in the Kiowa camp, the firelight painted Iola's face in gold and shadow. She sat beside her father, the chief, her voice low but certain as she told him of the man who had saved her life. She described not just the moment, but the way he stood, the steadiness of his hand, the way he did not demand thanks or ask questions. And then she added something else, words she chose carefully, so the fire could not catch them. Whatever they were, they made the chief's expression sharpen, his gaze shifting from the flames to the night beyond. "This man," he said at last, "must come to us." Outside, the wind curled through the camp, lifting the edges of the teepees. Somewhere beyond the circle of light, the horses shifted in the grass, sensing movement in the distance. The chief's decision had already begun to stir the camp into a quiet readiness. Back on the Carter ranch, John finished his work before the light failed. He felt the emptiness where she had stood, like a mark left on the air. The sound of that canyon whistle still lived in his mind, bright and sharp, though he did not understand why. He had no way of knowing that riders were already preparing to find him. The day began like any other, with the smell of dust and leather, and the low, restless sound of cattle moving toward the higher pasture. John rode ahead, the sun warm on his shoulders, the reins loose in his hand. The land opened wide here, rolling toward the cliffs where the grass met stone, and the air was bright and thin. By midday, the herd had settled into a slow, steady pace. John guided them toward a narrow pass between two great shoulders of rock. The stone rose high on either side, weathered into jagged edges by wind and time. It was cooler in the shade there, and the echoes of hoofbeats bounced oddly between the walls. Then came another sound. Hooves, not his, not the herd's. Faster. Closer. John's hand slid toward the carbine strapped to his saddle, but before he could draw, a sharp crack rang out. Not aimed at him, a warning shot into the air. The herd shied, and his horse tossed its head, muscles bunching under the saddle. From both sides of the pass, they appeared. Riders in painted headbands, eagle feathers lifting and falling with the wind. Their ponies moved like shadows, hooves light on the rock. In an instant they had closed the space, their formation tightening into a half-circle before him. "Hold it there," one of them called, though the words weren't in English. The tone left no doubt. John's fingers stayed near the stock of his weapon, but he knew the balance was against him. More riders emerged from behind, sealing the way back. Another shot barked into the air, the echo snapping off the canyon walls. His horse danced under him, uneasy. They didn't rush him. They moved with deliberate precision, a quiet confidence that spoke of skill and of knowing exactly why they were here. One rider dismounted, taking the reins of John's horse without force, but with a grip that brooked no argument. Another relieved him of the carbine. The air smelled of sun-warmed leather, sweat, and the faint tang of sage carried from somewhere beyond the rocks. They turned his horse toward a side trail, narrower and steeper than he would have chosen. The herd was left behind, the cattle milling in confusion. John glanced back once, the animals already shrinking into the distance. The trail wound upward, the stone underhoof shifting to gravel. The riders spoke little, their voices low, carrying in the still air. Above them, the sky had deepened to a hard, endless blue, and the cliff seemed to lean in, shadowing the way. It was late afternoon when the pass opened into a wide basin. Smoke curled in thin ribbons above hide-covered teepees. The smell of wood smoke and cooking fires mingled with the sharper scent of horses. Children paused in their games to watch as the party rode in. Dogs trotted alongside, barking once before falling silent. In the center of the camp, a space had been cleared. John was guided toward it, the faces around him unreadable in the shifting firelight. The circle was already forming. Somewhere among them, he caught the glint of familiar eyes. Iola! She stood near the edge of the gathering, her gaze steady on him as the riders brought their captive to a halt. The riders led John through the center of the camp, where the ground was trampled flat and dust rose in slow swirls with each step. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and something herbal, sage, maybe, or sweetgrass, carried from the fires. They brought him to a wide circle marked out by stones. At its heart stood a tall wooden post, weathered smooth from years of wind and sun. Around it, people gathered in rows, their faces half-lit by the flames that licked and shifted in the cooling air. The shadows played across the hides of the teepees, where painted patterns, horses, rivers, spirals seemed to move with the flicker of light. Men stood in groups, speaking low. Women sat together, their eyes keen and watchful. Children peeked from behind their mothers, silent, the way children are when something unusual is unfolding. On the far side of the fire sat the shaman, cross-legged, wrapped in a robe of deep earth tones. Feathers swayed from his hair, catching bits of the firelight. In his hands he held a drum, its skin taut, the surface painted with simple, ancient signs. He struck it once, a deep, hollow sound that seemed to reach into John's ribs. They sat him near the post, not yet bound, as if letting the camp take the measure of him. From the edge of the gathering, Ella stepped forward. The beadwork on her dress caught the light, throwing back little sparks of color. She spoke in her own language, voice quiet but clear, the syllables flowing like water over stone. John didn't understand a word, but her eyes, steady, searching, seemed to press a question he couldn't quite grasp. He wanted to speak, but found himself watching instead, reading what he could in the tilt of her head, the set of her shoulders. Two warriors moved in. Their faces gave nothing away. Without a word, they lifted him to his feet and guided him the short distance to the post. The wood was cool against his back as they set him in place. Rope bit into his wrists, coarse and dry, the fibers scratching his skin as they pulled it tight. Another loop went across his chest, pinning him firm against the grain. From somewhere in the crowd, a voice called out, sharp, brief, and was answered by another. He couldn't tell if it was challenge or approval. The shaman struck his drum again. The sound rolled out into the night like distant thunder. Around him, the circle tightened. The faces were closer now, the firelight brighter. Sparks leapt into the dark sky, carried upward by the wind. The air seemed to hum. With the beat of the drum, with the low murmur of voices, with something else he couldn't name. He searched for Iola in the crowd. She had stepped back but was still watching him. Her expression had shifted, less guarded now, but no less intense. The shaman's drumbeat deepened, steady as a heartbeat. The fire cracked and hissed. Somewhere behind him, the rope creaked under the pull of the knots. John realized he had no idea what would happen next. And for the first time that day, he felt the first real edge of fear. The drumbeat slowed, then faded into silence, leaving only the hiss of the fire and the soft shifting of the crowd. A path opened in the ring of people, and through it came a tall figure draped in a robe of dark hide. His hair, streaked with silver, was bound with a headband set with a single eagle feather. The way he carried himself made the air seem heavier. The chief stopped a few steps from John, his shadow stretching across the dust. For a long moment, he simply looked at him, eyes steady, searching in a way that felt almost like touch. Iola stepped forward, speaking in her own tongue. The chief listened without glancing at her, his gaze still fixed on John. Her voice was calm but quick, the rise and fall of the syllables hinting at urgency. When she finished, the chief nodded once, slowly. Another voice joined in, a younger man who stood near Iola. His English was accented, the words careful. The chief asks, "Why you helped her?" John drew in a slow breath. "Because she needed it," he said simply. The translator hesitated, as if expecting more, then turned and repeated it. The chief's mouth curved, not into a smile exactly, but into something that acknowledged the answer. He spoke again, his tone low, measured. The younger man translated, "You will stay here. Not as prisoner, not as guest. You will remain until the chief knows you." John's wrists ached under the ropes. "And if I don't agree?" The translation brought no visible reaction from the chief. Only the faintest tilt of the head, as if to say that agreement was irrelevant. 2 warriors stepped forward, loosening the rope from the post but not freeing his hands entirely. They turned him toward the outer ring of fires, where the camp's glow met the darkness of the open plain. A smaller post waited there, beside a low fire. The crowd began to disperse, conversations rising again, but John felt the weight of their eyes even as they turned away. The chief moved back through the people, the eagle feather swaying once before disappearing into the sea of bodies. Iola lingered a moment longer, watching as the warriors guided John to the new post. She said something, just a single word, and though he didn't understand it, the sound stayed with him as the ropes were tied again. The flames nearby were lower here, their light throwing longer shadows. The smoke was cooler, the sounds of the camp slightly muffled. Somewhere behind him, a coyote called, its voice thin against the stillness. John shifted against the ropes, feeling the slow drag of the knots against his skin. He could see across the camp to where Iola stood with her father, speaking in low tones. The chief's face was unreadable, but once, just once, he thought he saw the older man glance his way. The nights were colder here than on his own land. The rope that held him to the smaller post allowed him to sit, to shift enough to keep the blood moving, but never far enough to forget he was being watched. The warriors who guarded him stood just beyond the glow of the fire, still as carved figures until the light caught the glint of their eyes. By day, the camp moved around him. He saw hunters return with meat slung over their ponies, women grinding grain in shallow stone bowls, children chasing each other through the grass. The smell of smoke and roasting meat mingled with the sharper scent of hides drying in the sun. From where he sat, John could see the center fire. At times, voices would rise in song, the rhythm marked by the steady beat of a drum. Dancers moved there at night, their shadows cast high on the walls of the teepees, the flicker of feathers and fringe catching in the firelight. He was given water twice a day, food once, thick broth in a wooden bowl, enough to keep him upright but never enough to ease the constant hunger. The guards spoke little, sometimes changing shifts without a word. Their presence was constant, the air between them and him thick with an unspoken message, "You are here because we allow it." And then there was Iola. Sometimes he would see her in the distance, speaking to the women by the drying racks or walking between the teepees with her head high, her beadwork flashing in the sun. Once, she passed close enough that he caught the scent of smoke and sage in her hair. She looked at him only briefly, but in that moment her eye seemed to catch and hold his. It was on the 3rd night that she came for him. 2 guards untied him, leaving the rope looped around his wrists, and gave the other end into her hands. She said something to them, and they stepped back. She began to walk, the rope light in her grip, and he followed. They crossed the camp, the fires glowing low, until the land opened into a small rise beyond the teepees. The stars there were endless, sharper, brighter than any he had seen in years. Iola spoke softly, gesturing to constellations he didn't know, her voice carrying the rhythm of a story. He didn't understand the words, but the sound of them was a kind of music. He found himself watching her more than the sky, tracing the lines of her face in the starlight. For a moment, something in him wanted to step closer, to forget the rope, the guards, and the woman waiting for him back home. But the moment ended. A shape moved at the edge of the darkness, one of the guards. His voice was low but firm. Iola's jaw tightened. She turned, leading John back down the rise. By the time they reached the smaller post, the guards had changed. She said nothing as the rope was tied again. Only when she stepped back into the firelight did she glance at him, her eyes carrying something he couldn't name before she disappeared into the shadows. The morning after Iola had led him to the rise, the camp felt different. The voices were lower, the laughter of the children shorter, as if even they sensed a shift in the air. John noticed the way eyes followed her now, not with the usual warmth, but with something sharper, questioning. Near the central fire, the chief stood with 2 elders. Iola approached, her head high, but her steps slowed when the chief turned to face her. His voice was not raised, yet every word carried the weight of authority. He gestured toward John's post, then toward the open plain beyond the camp. John couldn't hear the words, but he saw the tension in Iola's shoulders, the way her hands closed into fists at her sides. The chief's gaze was stern, unyielding. Finally, she gave a short nod, her chin dipping in reluctant agreement. The elders stepped back, and the chief dismissed her with a single wave of his hand. From that moment, she kept her distance. She passed near his post once, carrying a bundle of herbs, but her eyes stayed forward. John wanted to speak, though he had no words that could cross the space between them, the space guarded not just by rope and warriors, but now by the will of her father. That night, the camp was restless. Warriors came and went in small groups, speaking in hushed tones. Fires burned lower, their light revealing brief flashes of movement, a spear being inspected, a painted shield set against a teepee wall. Somewhere nearby, the shaman's drum tapped a slow, steady beat, too quiet for a dance, too deliberate for casual practice. John's guards were more alert than usual. One stood close enough that the edge of his shadow cut across John's boots, never moving. The other walked the perimeter, scanning the dark beyond the camp. It felt less like he was being kept in, and more like something was being kept out. He shifted against the post, the rope rough against his wrists. Every so often, he caught fragments of conversation, a word repeated with the cadence of warning, another spoken like a name. He could tell the warriors were preparing for something, though whether it concerned him, he couldn't yet be sure. Iola appeared once more before the night was over. She stood at a distance, near the edge of the firelight, speaking with one of the younger warriors. Her eyes found John's across the space, holding for a heartbeat before she looked away. It was enough to confirm what he already felt, something was coming. And whatever it was, he was in the center of it. They came for him at dusk. Two warriors approached without a word, their faces unreadable in the fading light. One cut the rope from the post, the other took hold of it immediately, the coarse fiber still looped around his wrists. They led him toward the center of the camp, where the ground had been swept clear and the fire burned high. The people were already gathering, forming a wide circle around the flames. Shadows stretched long across the dust, swaying as the firelight flickered. The smell of smoke was heavy, mixed with the resin of burning pine and the sharp bite of sage. Somewhere within the crowd, the shaman's drum began to speak, slow, deep, unchanging, like the measured beat of a great heart. At the center of the cleared space stood a long, low table of raw timber, darkened by years of use. Its surface was smooth, but the edges were scarred, carved with symbols he couldn't read. They guided him to it, pressing his back down until the wood was cold beneath his shoulder blades. Leather straps secured his arms and legs, each knot tightened until his breath caught. The circle closed. Faces emerged from the shadows, elders with eyes like flint, warriors with paint streaked across their cheeks, women holding small bundles of herbs and feathers. The children were kept behind the line of adults, their wide eyes glinting in the firelight. Iola stood opposite the fire from him, her face half-lit, half-hidden. Her dress caught the glow, beadwork shifting like tiny constellations when she moved. She didn't speak, but her gaze found his and held it, steady, almost fierce. The shaman stepped forward, sprinkling handfuls of powder into the flames. Sparks leapt upward, vanishing into the dark sky. The drumbeat deepened, joined now by a low chant that rolled through the circle in waves. It was not a song meant to comfort. It was meant to bind, to remind everyone present that this was more than spectacle. John's heartbeat matched the drum, each thud heavy in his chest. His eyes kept going back to Iola, to the unblinking way she watched him. There was no fear in her face, not for herself, not even for him. Something else lay there, something he couldn't name but felt pressing against him across the fire. The crowd parted just enough for the chief to enter the circle. He came slowly, each step deliberate. When he reached John's side, he stood for a long moment, letting the chant flow around them. Then he spoke, his voice deep, resonant, carrying easily without force. John didn't know the words, but their weight was unmistakable. The tone was not of anger, nor of mercy, it was the voice of someone declaring a truth that could not be undone. The chief leaned closer, saying something more, the syllables falling like measured blows. From the corner of his vision, John saw Iola take a step forward, her lips parting as if to speak, but she stopped, her eyes fixed on the chief. And in that instant, John understood without translation, whatever happened next would decide everything. Whether he became part of this world, or vanished from it entirely, was no longer his choice.